Welcome to the Chapter 8 in AI Evalves for Everyone course. In this chapter, we'll tie together everything that we've learned in the previous chapters about different phases and form a comprehensive picture on what the complete evaluation process looks like. So let's dive right into it. So if you see broad themes until now in chapters that we discussed, we are seeing two different phases. One is a pre-deployment phase and a list of things that we want to do, and one is the production phase. Think of these two as like the very distinctive phases of the product development, and the kind of responsibilities and the metrics that you build explicitly identify in solving these particular goals. And let's examine what they actually mean. Like in the pre-deployment phase, you are essentially building confidence that before the users interact, you are acting as a pseudo user, formulating what the users might use your product for, and making sure you are like doing well in those use cases. And in the phase 2, which is the production, you are making sure that the product is actually doing what it's supposed to do, and also you have the right checks and balances in place where if there is something going wrong, you are being notified of that. So to understand this idea better, let's imagine the cases of what a product looks like if you don't actually do any of this. So if you don't implement phase 1 or phase 2, then your product is similar to, like, say, vibe coding something with a basic prompt and then like shipping it right to the user. You haven't tested out yourself whether the product is actually working, or you just have like this collection of prompts which just like are meant to work for every user. Now, let's say if you did phase 1 and did not do phase 2, what does it look like? So if you completed phase 1, you know that your product is supposed to work for this particular set of use cases, and you deployed the product to production, and then you stop caring about it. You're not caring about user feedback. You're not caring about any missteps the product is taking in production, and then you're not actually learning from what the product is doing in production so that you can improve it in further. So that is what absence of phase 2 will look like. So phase 1 and phase 2 are extremely important, and these two combined together create this flywheel of product improvement. And what do we talk about phase 1 and phase 2 is the list of these 7 steps where you're like understanding the context, building reference data sets, and everything that we discussed in the previous chapters, right until emerging issue discovery. So all of these steps together form a complete deployment, or like a product improvement lifecycle. And this is the reason I call this a cycle, is because it's not a one and done process, in the sense that you just do the phase 1 and phase 2 and you cannot call the product as complete, because there's always going to be new information, there's always going to be new user behavior patterns or new use cases that you're building. So think of this more as a cycle that keeps repeating over for a certain set of features that you want to build. That is a very key distinction, that it's not a traditional software where you're building a database and then deploying it and expect it to work 100% of the time. Now let's dive deep into each of these phases and what they actually means, to recollect and tie down what we actually discussed in the previous chapters. For the first phase, the first thing is understanding context. This is where all the product and the business knowledge come into the play, and understand what you're actually trying to build and scope out the problem very well. This implies things like, identifying who are the key stakeholders and what do you need to communicate with them for the product decision, and also understanding what are the types of customers that are going to use your product, and limiting the kind of use cases that your initial version of the product is going to solve. Once you have that nailed out, we need to build reference data sets, and this is what we discussed in the earlier chapters, where you are ensuring that certain behaviors can actually keep functioning in the product, and these are your proxy metrics to understand whether certain behavior has changed. For example, if you're building a customer support, you should make sure that you have a data set, for example, understanding whether it's issuing refunds in the right context. So for that, you might build a data set of negatives and positives, and making sure that you're getting a good score on that data set. And this is extremely business dependent again, on what your data set needs to be, because it depends directly on what information you've gathered from step 1, which is understanding context. Now, the step 3 is implementing metrics. This is the evaluation metrics that we talked about again in the earlier chapters. Basically, there are multiple classes of evaluation metrics which kind of summarize and explain the context that you've gained until now, and how do you assess whether your product is going to do well on the data sets that you've built until now. So that is the idea of implementing these offline metrics, where you are asserting that importance. So at the end of this, you have a comprehensive knowledge, or like artifacts that dictate your product's intention, as well as making sure that you have the right set of like scales in mind, which are measuring your product's effectiveness in these scenarios. So once we do that, we can go to the phase 2, which is actually deploying your product in production. And then you see that actually, okay, my product is in production, it's doing things that I expect it to do. But then you also start realizing that there are a lot of cases that you haven't thought of. And this is extremely common, especially in deploying like machine learning and AI products. But the key idea is to approach this in a step-by-step process so that you are laying the groundwork to actually improve your product overall. So in this, the first part is log filtering that we discussed earlier, where we are understanding what kind of interactions do I need to actually log so that I can go back and analyze it in the background. And then there's also metric selection. And this metric selection is different from the metrics that we talked about in the phase 1. In the phase 1, these are more similar to offline metrics, which are more suitable for analyzing complex scenarios. And the metric selection here is not evaluating the interaction alone based on the offline metrics, but it's also subtly gauging for like user conversation signals, or like just the product usability signals and things like that. And once you have those metrics, you also need to implement guardrails and flywheels. And why do we talk about guardrails and flywheels together? It's because in guardrails, you are essentially identifying what are the harmful behaviors of the product that you cannot let go to the customer at any cost. So these need online checks, and which are like cheap and simple to implement. And then you have these guardrails in place so that your product is behaving well within its limits. At the same time, flywheel, because these are very similar kind of checks which understand whether an interaction is going well or not, but in a much deeper level. So you have time for running this analysis on understanding error patterns, doing pattern analysis and things like that. So the flywheel becomes that you identify this new error patterns and then like feed them back to your product development process via offline metrics, evaluation data sets, and gathering more context. And this is the 7th part that we discussed about issue discovery. So all of this combined together make sure that once you're deployed the product in production, you actually keep learning from it and channel the right information back to phase 1. So a continuous loop of phase 1 and phase 2 is what actually keeps your product evolving as time passes by. Now the key principles again to follow through all of these steps are to start simple and only incrementally build. Do not come up with like an extensive set of metrics and complex LLM judges with reasoning models that are running on high juice just to make sure, just because like your product use case is simple. More often than not, in many of the products that we've built and we've seen other successful companies built, it's always like starting simple, really focusing on what is the problem that you're trying to solve for the customer and working backwards from there. So that is the first key principle. And then there's other ones are focusing on context and embracing the evolution. So the reason we keep emphasizing this loop or this continuous iterative process of improvement is that change is inevitable, and we basically need to be prepared for understanding how your product is evolving rather than making sure that you did 100% of the groundwork first and then developing the model. And once all of this is in place, like making sure that you are connecting the loop to facilitate this kind of improvement is extremely important. And that is essentially like all the processes is about. So this is what we're talking about, this loop of going from build to test, which is your offline testing with evaluation process and metrics, and then learning from your production and then expanding your data set so that you continuously keep improving your model, not because of like any new feature you're adding, but making sure that you are actually putting in the hours to identify different edge cases and safeguarding your product against them, or like even getting signal in like new kinds of interactions. So this is essentially very important for like building AI products. So the key takeaways in this module that we discussed right now is always follow a two-phase approach where you're separating what happens in production versus what happens in offline, so that you have a distinction of what kind of metrics to use in which scenario. And the second one is 7 clear steps that we talked about, which form this nice little loop of product improvement. And again, A key emphasis on this is just because it's a flywheel, it's not automated. A lot of product thinking and a lot of engineering mindset goes into this in actually making this loop happen. But the idea is to have the right set of constructs in place so that you can close this loop instead of bouncing back and forth. And finally, never complete is what we keep talking about. AI products are never one and done. You can deploy them as long as you care about customer engagement quality. You need to keep iterating upon this and build an effective product. In the next chapter, we will be talking about common misconceptions in each of these phases and what exactly do we need to address them and how those misconceptions creep in and how do you be more mindful of like not letting that affect your product.